So basically, as Sarah has just introduced, me and Tim are going to kick things off, basically talking you through the research that Sustrans have done in inclusive cycling in cities related to gender in cycling, and basically going to tell you the findings that we found from our research as to sort of why we're putting on this event today. So, what is the problem? Well, women are cycling less than men, and one of our key starting points for finding this was from our Bike Life study. So Bike Life is one of the biggest assessments of cycling in UK cities, and we've basically found in the 7 cities that took part in Bike Life, a gender gap exists in cycling. So as you can see from this graph, it's quite dramatic. So this shows the percentage of people who cycle at least once a week in the 7 cities. And as you can see, the orange bar represents women and the pink/red is men. There's a gap in every city. And basically aggregated this data as well. So across all 7 cities, we found that nearly 75% of women never cycle. So what are we going to do about this? Well, Sustrans want to try and address sort of our overall aim is how do we make cycling more inclusive in Scotland? And our starting point for trying to address this aim is to try and answer these 3 questions. Why do fewer women cycle compared to men? How do women's travel experiences differ from men? And what needs to change in order to reduce the gender gap in cycling? And that's where today's event comes in. We want to keep this solution-driven and start talking solutions. So let's take you through our research approach and what we've done so far. So we've started with a literature review to sort of review what we already know about gender in cycling and active travel. We've also conducted a qualitative study in Glasgow where we spoke to around about 40 women to ask them about their perceptions of cycling and their experiences of cycling. We then wanted to drill into the Bike Life dataset further. So this really rich dataset of nearly 8,000 surveys across 7 major UK cities. We basically wanted to find out what the differences were in men and women's experiences of cycling in cities. So we've produced both these reports on the right there, summarising the findings from this research so far. And the idea of having these reports was the hope that transport policymakers and planners would kind of read this research and start thinking about more inclusive cycling design. But how do we ensure that our research is taken forward? Well, this is where today's event comes into play. So the aim of this Roundtable event is basically to work with others who are experts in this area and kind of establish the critical next steps for trying to close this gender gap. So we want to hear from you guys. We want to hear how we're going to solve this gender gap. So to facilitate discussions, let's just review some of the key findings again from our research. We did find, which is good, that women do think cycling is a good thing. Many want to cycle more, and they also recognise the benefits. So just taking it back to Bike Life again, nearly 70% of people say their city would be a better place to live if more people cycled, which is great. There's also a substantial amount of women who don't ride a bike but would like to. And as I mentioned, women do recognise the benefits of cycling. So sort of 3 key motivations that we found from our Glasgow study was that women see health and fitness as a motivation to cycle. For many women, they see it as an easy way to integrate physical activity into their everyday, often very busy routines, which is key. Secondly, mental health benefits, the mental health benefits that you can gain from physical activity through cycling. But as well, many of the women that we spoke to kind of talked about cycling as kind of me time, and it was headspace for women to reflect, which is really important. And thirdly, social connections. Many women that we spoke to in Glasgow talked very positively about kind of the sociability of cycling as an activity and making friends and feeling part of a community. So then, what are the barriers? Why aren't more women cycling? Well, again, we've kind of summarised these as 3 key barriers that we found from our research. The number one reason, and probably the most important one, was safety. Safety kind of presented itself as 2 issues in our research: personal safety and road safety. So we found that 77% of women think cycling safety in their city needs improving, which is quite an astonishing amount. We also found that women tend to feel less safe cycling during day and during night compared to men. So why are women feeling less safe? It's a question that needs to be answered. Another key barrier that we found was time and trip chaining. So the percentage of women in employment over the past few years has increased. I think around 75% of mothers are now in employment. However, the gender division of household tasks and caregiving roles is still imbalanced. And it's basically women trying to balance paid and this unpaid work is the issue here. And women will find it difficult to integrate these shorter trips through these inadequate transport systems. The third and final barrier that we found was appearance. So many women picked up on the sort of issue of appearance, and this was especially talked to in relation to cycling to work. So many women were discouraged from cycling because of the expectation to look a certain way on arrival at their destination, which deterred a lot of women. Over to Tim.
Okay. Thank you, Megan. So we know that women tend to cycle less than men. We know that a lot of women think that, or most women think that cycling is a good fit and would like to cycle or cycle more. But we also know that there are specific barriers that get in the way. Before I kind of get into kind of key recommendations, I just wanted to show a snapshot of the bike life data, so the assessment of city cycling across the UK in cities. Sorry. It's quite clear from here. What do actually people want, or what would they find it very useful to cycle, to start cycling or cycling more? And that issue of space and not wanting to share the road with large vehicles, with buses, with lorries, with cars is absolutely critical. So physically separated space or traffic-free away from roads is really important. But what's also quite interesting about this is it's not just women. It's replicated amongst men. It's replicated against many other demographic groups as well. So I think whilst we're talking and focusing on women, actually a lot of the recommendations that I'm certainly about to present to you apply to many different demographic groups and intersect with disabled people, older people, for example. We also know that women would like more investment to change their city, to improve cycling, and we also know that women, just like men, would like to see protected bike lanes, even if that means less space for other road traffic. So in terms of recommendations, we've grouped them into 3 key areas that all complement one another. The first being governance, place second, and then finally people themselves, or women in particular. In terms of governance, we've talked about this quite a lot at Sustrans over the last year, certainly internally and externally, but we really need to start fostering better representation of women in the transport sector, especially amongst senior transport planners and amongst decision makers. In the UK, women represent about 20% of jobs in the transport sector. It's even less. I think in Scotland, a recent Engender report showed that it was 6% amongst senior roles in the profession. So yeah, we need to encourage more women into the profession, but we also need to retain and enable women to become leaders within the profession. Secondly, we need to take into account the views and the needs of women. And a classic example of this, a recent classic example of this, actually comes from England with the cycling and walking cycling and walking infrastructure strategy safety review. This consultation had a record number of responses, 14,000 in total. Of that, 75% were men. Presumably, of that, the vast majority of responses were people that already cycle. Are we designing cycling for the people that are already cycling, or do we need to be better in terms of how we reach out and speak and engage with groups that currently do not? Thirdly, we need to develop a culture through policy and practice that makes cycling feel attractive and relevant to women and to other people that don't cycle. People need to see people like themselves cycling. People need to feel that they don't have to keep up with other people riding bikes. And that starts at a governance level. That starts with policies and strategies and how we portray cycling through the media, through publications, strategies, etc. And last but not least, by doing those top three, hopefully we start to ensure that gender and other issues relating to equality are properly integrated into transport plans and policies. At the moment, it's talked about and there is some bold aspiration, but when you get to the actual how, it's normally quite lacking. Place, secondly, and I think more importantly, how do we actually design places that are suitable and attractive for all people to cycle? Firstly, obviously planning routes based not just on the numbers, but on the need to cycle and the benefits that those users can get from cycling. We know that women, in comparison to men, don't do so well in terms of meeting physical activity targets across the UK. So it's not just about how do we get people to cycle into the city centres and back out again, it's how do we actually transform neighbourhoods and local routes that connect people like women to where they need to go. And if women are making multiple short trip chaining journeys, then actually the potential is huge from women. And we see in many cities and countries elsewhere that are starting to get this right, actually men cycle less than women do. We need to also develop a dense network of protected cycle routes across urban areas supported by off-road routes and routes on quiet streets. That space is absolutely critical. But we also need to better improve off-road routes on quiet streets so that in the hours of darkness, in winter in Edinburgh, women feel safe and men feel safe, everyone feels safe being able to cycle during hours of darkness. We need to reduce the volume and speed of traffic on local streets and create streets where people walking and cycling have priority. And I think that came through really clearly in many of the focus groups and research that we've been doing. It's not just about improving cycling, it's about making sure that cars aren't as dominant as they have been, and our roads aren't purely designed for moving cars as quickly as possible. And last but not least, integrate cycling where people live and into their destinations, including secure cycle storage, including showers, etc. At work. Finally, people. I think women were very supportive of new innovation around cycles, such as increasing access to electric cycles, cargo cycles, all sorts of things was prominent through the research that we did. We do need to provide support and training for women to build their confidence, social-led rides, etc. But I just want to make sure that's a point that rests on designing your city better. It needs to go hand in hand. There's no point trying to encourage women to cycle if the conditions on the roads are not adequate. And then last and finally, we need to educate all people, not just women, men, women, to see cycling as an inclusive, everyday activity, an activity that is open to everyone, not just people that are unafraid to share road space. And campaigns like This Girl Can need to be replicated for cycling to engender that culture of inclusivity. Before I pass over the stand to the next speaker, I just wanted to quickly mention what's next for Sustrans. We've signed the declaration for the EU's Women in Transport, Platform for Change. That means that we're basically taking steps internally at Sustrans to ensure that workforce gender balance is more even, and especially at senior levels across the organisation. We're putting being inclusive at the heart of our work. We've got two main priorities, one on the National Cycle Network and Pathways for Everyone, and the second about livable cities for everyone. for everyone has been inserted into everything that we do now, and there's lots of conversations, and in fact there's a board conversation next week at Sustrans about what does that mean and how do we do that better as an organisation. And then last but not least, we're undertaking further research around other demographics, and I'm personally working with Arup and other people at Sustrans to better identify when it comes to older people, when it comes to disabled people, what do we need to do to make our cities more inclusive in the future, and how do we design that in? And certainly for Bike Life as a programme, that's become really important. And you'll see from the new survey that we are just about to undertake, questions coming in that are much more focused on inclusivity. I think in the past we've kind of very much focused on things like the percentage of people that cycle to and from work, usually by bike. Is that the most important thing that we should be looking for? Or should we be looking at the gender balance in our cities as a key metric for what constitutes a successful cycling city? I'm going to leave it there because I know I'm over time, and thank you.